Well, first up, our top story. Russia's invasion of Ukraine was pushed into crisis mode after the leader of the mercenary fighter group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, declared war on Russia's military leadership. In a critical video posted on social media, Prigozhin criticized the country's leadership for starting the war. He further stated the Ukrainian forces were successfully pushing back the Russian army, but the conflict blew up later as Prigozhin claimed that the Russian military leaders had ordered strikes on his men, killing thousands of them. Now, in a shock twist, the rebel mercenaries advancing towards Moscow were turned around by the Prigozhin leader. After a day of escalating military tensions, the head of the Wagner group said he had called off the advance of troops to the Russian capital to avoid bloodshed. The short-lived military coup marks the most serious challenge to Vladimir Putin's rule since he came to power in late 1999. The US and its allies are now taking on Putin's authority in the aftermath of this mutiny. And the US Secretary of State said Wagner's short-lived uprising marked a direct challenge to Putin's authority. Antony Blinken flagged real cracks in the Russian state authority. The French President Macron said the march on Moscow shows divisions within the Russian camp and the fragility of both its military and its auxiliary forces. Meanwhile, Britain said it was prepared for a range of scenarios in Russia, noting the potentially destabilizing impact of the tensions between the Wagner Group and President Vladimir Putin.
Yes, I've spoken to the leader of the United States, but also France and Germany over the weekend. We're completely coordinated on our response to this. It's a situation that we've been monitoring for some time, the instability that would be caused by Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. And what we saw over this weekend is an example of that coming to the fore. It's obviously too early to predict with certainty what might happen as a result of this, but I'm in close touch with our allies and we're monitoring the situation closely.
And while quoting UK security forces, the British media reported Russian intelligence services threatened to harm families of the Wagner leaders. The Ukrainian leader, Volodymyr Zelensky, and the US President Joe Biden discussed the revolt ahead of the NATO summit next month. Zelensky said, and I quote here, "The world must put pressure on Russia until international order is restored." Kyiv, however, said the unrest offered a window of opportunity for its counter-offensive. On the other hand, the Chinese Foreign Ministry called the mercenary revolt Russia's internal affair and expressed support for Putin's government. The Wagner had only 8,000 fighters rather than 25,000 fighters it claimed, and faced likely defeat in any attempt to take the Russian capital. And for more on this, we are now being joined by Retired Colonel Rich Outzen from Washington, D.C. Outzen is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and the Jamestown Foundation. Colonel Outzen, thank you very much for talking to us this evening. This is by far the greatest challenge to Vladimir Putin since he came to power. Has he been significantly weakened or not?
Time will tell how significantly, but certainly any time the leader of a large and powerful nation with a large and powerful military is shown not to have what we call unity of command, not to have full control and monopoly over the use of force, it is a weakening of their position. So obviously Prigozhin and his 8,000 troops is not big enough to threaten actual control of the state. There were people predicting this could morph into a full civil war. There's a lot of talk about what Prigozhin's motives were, but once the families of the Wagner leadership were threatened and a few other skirmishes were conducted, Prigozhin backed down. But still, something like this is actually an armed insurrection, not a politically metaphoric insurrection, and a challenge to a leader like Putin who relies on authoritarianism and control of the military and force is a significant blow.
So certainly suggests a serious blow to his image. And the West will be watching this closely as well for its larger implications on the outcomes of the war in Ukraine, if any, actually.
Absolutely. So this may not determine the fate of Putin or the fate of Russia, but it certainly damages Wagner as a fighting force. Wagner has been a force that Putin has relied upon instead of or in preference over Russian regular forces in places like Mali, the Central African Republic, and Syria, and also in the fighting in Ukraine. So at a minimum now, we're seeing defections, not only with Prigozhin himself, sort of in a quasi-exile in Belarus, but we're seeing defections reportedly of some Wagner forces. You probably saw that the Wagner troops shot down approximately 9 aircraft, Russian aircraft, so they're brothers, so to speak, and resulting in the death, I think, of 17 pilots and crew members. So this is leading to some in the Wagner group to leave the group, saying we're not going to fight our own people. So Prigozhin, in the end, didn't bring down Putin, but he may have brought down Wagner.
Right. And in your assessment, what could be really the motivation for this revolt, you know, and the fact that he's safe and he's been sent to Belarus?
Well, I think the best explanation I've seen, and of course it's opaque, right? Very few people have knowledge of what goes on in the minds of a Prigozhin or a Putin. But the best explanation I've seen is that Prigozhin was not getting the resources he wanted from the Ministry of Defense. He was in a long-running feud with Shoigu and Gerasimov, the military leadership in Russia, and that he was being told that his role was not sustainable. Basically, Wagner could not take Bakhmut, at least not in a decisive way, and it was not the leading role that he had foreseen for his forces. So being starved of resources, being starved of fire support, and being in this long-running feud with the Ministry of Defense, he felt his position was eroding. And I think he did this high-stakes gamble in order to shore up that position, but he lost. He was gambling that Putin would sort of give him concessions as a result of a serious threat. But Putin sort of called his bluff, and I think it doesn't end well for Prigozhin here. I think that's what his motivation was, though.
Right. And finally, I do want to ask you this, Colonel Outzen. Now, the West truly doesn't have a side in this internal strife that has erupted over the weekend. Now, Prigozhin, whose men are accused of brutal human rights abuses on one side, and Putin, of course, who's revived, you know, a World War II style, war in many ways.
That's true. There's an old military adage that when your enemy is destroying himself, don't get in the way. So we see the strains and the stress of an unsuccessful war showing up in the Russian forces. The best thing for the West now is to let it play out. It's definitely going to damage Putin's war effort. It should give a little bit of sort of support to Ukraine's counteroffensive to take back some of its own territory. There are people who say, well, this was a big CIA operation. Of course, that's fantasy. We couldn't plan something like that and pull it off if we had even wanted to. But the best thing for the West is to watch and see and take advantage of what splits develop in the Russian war effort following this.
Right. Colonel Rich Outzen, appreciate you talking to us this evening and sharing your perspective and what this really means for Russia and for Vladimir Putin. Thanks for that.
Thank you. Thank you.